Hey, ladies and gentlemen. So, we're going to talk about labor, delivery, and lactation, the last little bit in your notes. Please use the teacher notes to fill in prior to this to help as you go along, or if you prefer to go along and stop and pause, that is fine as well. So, we're going to talk about four very key hormones that play a massive role in labor. And the first one is progesterone and estrogen, progesterone. We've already talked about this in the female feedback loop for earlier on in the chapter. But essentially, at this point, progesterone and estrogen are being secreted by the placenta throughout the entire pregnancy. And as it's being secreted, it maintains that endometrium lining. At the end of the pregnancy, these two hormones drop off. So they drastically drop off. And what ends up happening is this allows for another hormone to start to increase and allow uterine contractions to begin. Relaxin is another hormone that's produced by your placenta, and it's actually produced throughout your entire pregnancy. It allows for all the ligaments in your body to soften and loosen as females grow bigger. Okay, so think about the pressure on their knees, the pressure on their hips, the pressure on their back. It actually loosens areas up so that they're not as sore. It also starts to soften the cervix during labor. So the cervix is the plug on the uterus, and a female will give birth or can start pushing once the cervix has dilated to 10 centimeters. So essentially, it's stretching to allow for that baby to pass through. Oxytocin is the hormone that I was saying will ramp up and actually increase when we lose progesterone and estrogen. And this is because these control uterine and mammary gland contractions. So oxytocin ramps up to help with contractions of the uterus as you're going through labor. And then afterwards, it actually starts the contractions of the mammary glands found inside the breasts to help with milk production. Now, some women, as they go through labor and their body gets tired, their oxytocin actually drops a little. So there's actually some women will get hooked up to what is the word I'm looking for? Sorry, guys. They'll get hooked up with needles and whatnot. Oh my goodness, I cannot think of what I'm trying to say. Hopefully, you can get what I'm thinking here. Essentially, and they get pushed something through that's like oxytocin to help continue with their uterine contractions. And last but not least, we have prolactin. Prolactin, again, after delivery is released because it controls milk production, along with oxytocin with mammary gland production contractions. So those are the four hormones that you can add into your notes. And now I have not done this in the teacher notes, so you're going to need to fill in the feedback loop for labor, or what we call parturition. All right, I'm just going to quickly click this through so you can see the whole picture. And you can press pause here if you would like and write it in and then listen to the explanation. So here we have the posterior pituitary, and the posterior pituitary starts to secrete oxytocin to start up uterine contractions. And as the uterine contracts, it helps with the cervix stretching. So a woman will be in labor, they say on average for about 12 hours. Not all of it very tough labor. There's different stages of labor. But essentially, they'll be in labor having contractions as their cervix is softening. They're checking for that dilation so baby can be born. How does this work? This is not a normal feedback loop that we've seen before. This is not a negative feedback loop. This is a positive feedback loop, meaning every time the uterine contracts, the baby's head pushes down and the cervix stretches, rather than sending a message to stop the process, it's actually sending a message to continue the process. So you'll see as the cervix stretches, it sends a positive message up to the posterior pituitary saying, yeah, keep sending us oxytocin. This is really good. And it also, as the cervix stretches, sends a message to the uterine to keep contracting along with those oxytocin as it's getting oxytocin. Another hormone that plays a role in uterine contraction is prostaglandins. And so prostaglandins can help also amp up uterine contractions. Some doctors will recommend that pretty close to your delivery date that males and females should engage in intercourse, and that's simply because male sperm actually has prostaglandins in it. Does it work? Not 100% proven to be that it works, but some doctors will suggest it. So now that I've said those are the hormones of birth, that's the feedback loop. What are the stages of birth? There's actually a couple different stages of birth that occur. The first is stage 1, which is essentially labor, which can last in amongst 2 hours, quick and easy, or it can last 20 hours. It can last even longer. My sister-in-law was in labor for 72 hours before my nephew was born. So during this time, the whole point is to get that cervix to dilate. So you can look up here at the very first picture. Here's what the cervix looks like. It's kind of a plug. And then as baby is pushing against it, it dilates and stretches and stretches. And so baby can fully be released down into the vaginal canal and can be passed through. Okay, again, this is from the oxytocin coming from the pituitary gland. Our uterine muscles are stimulated and contracting and really pushing against baby to make baby push against the cervix so that we soften and stretch it. And this, again, like I said, causes more positive feedback to cause more oxytocin to be released. At this point, too, a female's water can break. It can happen prior to giving birth, or it can happen during the process of pushing. But essentially, what happens is the amniotic sac ruptures, and this is what we refer to as the water breaking. It helps lubricate the birth canal. A female whose water breaks prior to her pushing, they don't do a lot of internal exams then because it's not safe. You don't want to get bacteria and stuff in there. So they won't do as many internal exams if your water's already broken. If your water hasn't broken, they will break it as you are going through to the pushing part of labor. So the next stage is delivery, which can take about 20 minutes. It can take 10 minutes. It can take no time at all, or it can take 2 hours. All right. It can take up to now. Their new recommendation is they will let women push for as long as 4 hours, as long as baby is not in distress, to help reduce the amount of C-sections needed. So what happens is contractions give the expulsion of the fetus. So essentially you're pushing baby out, and there's a lot of different positions mom can take in this case. She can be standing up, she can be squatting, she can be laying down, she could be in water. Lots of different options for mom as she pushes baby. Then the third stage, I've mentioned this before, is afterbirth. This is when you birth the placenta and the umbilical cord. And you can kind of see a picture over here of what that looks like. I have another picture, like I said, I'll show you guys in a Zoom meeting at some point of a one up close. Okay, so what you got to do is afterbirth continues, you push, the oxytocin's still there, it's still getting contractions, and you give birth to the placenta. All right, baby's out. Now you got to feed baby. So baby is going to latch onto the breast, and this is causing lactation. So lactation is the formation and secretion of breast milk, essentially, and prolactin, which is produced in the anterior pituitary once baby is born, actually initiates that first milk production. Okay. We need the calcium that's found in our milk production for things like nerve impulses, bones and teeth, muscle contractions, blood clotting. Sorry, guys. Blood clotting, they're all really important. Okay. Now, that being said, some women cannot breastfeed after giving birth. Some women are on certain medications that don't allow them. Baby never latches properly. They don't produce milk. They will use formula, or they will use something else perhaps to help feed baby, which is like they can do pumping instead of latching, for example. These are all forms, but essentially lactation is the production of milk by the breasts. So again, oxytocin is also involved in this. It actually triggers the release of milk, and this is caused by a positive feedback loop from the baby sucking. Now, for ladies out there, when you get a little older and you have children, they call this the letdown. And essentially, if you've ever had your hand fall asleep, okay, and it tingles and it hurts to touch stuff, that's kind of the feeling of the release of milk that happens. Okay. Again, breast milk contains fats, proteins, carbs, vitamins, minerals, antibodies, white blood cells for baby. And the difference between these two is prolactin initiates production and oxytocin releases. So that's only the difference between the two, released from two different areas of the brain, and one is used in uterine contractions as well. So this is kind of how we draw the lactation loop. Okay, so prolactin is released from the pituitary gland. Okay, and oxytocin is also released from the pituitary gland, one from anterior, one from posterior. Baby latches and produces that positive feedback to continually produce those two hormones. So we have milk production and milk ejection. So how we're going to draw this is we're going to follow along and we're going to label the stages. So one is suckling stimulates nerve endings, which causes the neural pathways to carry that stimulus to the hypothalamus to produce oxytocin. And oxytocin causes the mammary lobules to contract and milk letdown occurs. So that's just kind of the key part there. Okay, and then it continues on. So in this case, I'm not actually including prolactin. This is just more or less the lactation loop for oxytocin, how we get milk ejected from the breast. So you can add this into the space as well. So ladies and gentlemen, that is all. And if you have questions, please let me know.